All right, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. My name is Bashan Horsley, part of the event staff with Politics and Prose. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in this virtual format. Before we get started, just have a few quick items. First, at any point during this event, you can always click below into the chat section, and you can click a link to purchase the book, Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America. Takes you directly to Politics and Prose's website. Also, if anyone has any questions that they would like to ask the author, we ask that you go to the separate Q&A section and then insert your questions there. That way we can try to field as many as possible towards the end. So that said, I would like to welcome Kurt Andersen. His new book, Evil Geniuses, The Unmaking of America, is a follow-up to Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, his prize-winning best-selling history of America's weakness for entertaining falsehoods and self-invented truths. In addition to that, he's the author of 4 critically acclaimed best-selling novels, You Can't Spell America Without Me, True Believers, Heyday, and Turn of the Century. Andersen also co-created and hosted the Peabody Award-winning public radio show Studio 360, co-founded Spy Magazine, was a columnist and critic for The New Yorker, New York, and Time, as well as editor-in-chief of New York. And he will be joined tonight by Michael Tomasky. Michael is a columnist for The Daily Beast, a contributing opinion writer for The New York Times, a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, and the editor of Democracy, a Journal of Ideas. So that said, I will turn the floor over to you, gentlemen.
Okie dokie. Thanks, Bashan. And good evening, everyone. And hi, Kurt.
Hi, Michael.
Kurt, yes, was the editor of New York Magazine and was my editor at New York Magazine, hired me, whether he gets the credit or blame for that in 1995, I think it was. And we had a too brief association, alas, which perhaps we'll talk about or perhaps not. We'll see if we have time to work it in there. But it's great to be here. It's a real privilege to be asked to do this. It's a great book. So let's start. First question is a simple one. You're Kurt Andersen. You could have written a lot of books. You could have written about history or culture, or could have written another novel. Why'd you write this book?
Well, I had started a novel 6 years ago when I mentioned the Fantasyland as a possible next book. I hadn't published a big nonfiction book with my publisher, and I said, "Here's the basic idea," and she said, "Well, that sounds great. Maybe you should do that sooner rather than later." So I did, and then the idea being, "But you should return to finishing the novel," she said, and then Fantasyland came out, and as I finished it, as I did the research for that, as I was talking about it to readers, actually going out and talking about it, I realized that it was half of a story that I had to tell, and half of a thing that I had thought I had figured out, which is this kind of cultural, magical thinking, epistemology problem that America had versus the hard politics and economics and technology problems. And so I decided, okay, I need to write this. This is sort of not exactly literally a second volume of a 2-volume history, but kind of. Yeah. So that's why I decided to do this. And people responded to Fantasyland. So I thought, okay, let's talk about how this other way that America, it seemed to me, had changed so dramatically in my lifetime, from my youth to my adulthood. Let's talk about the other half of it. And so that's what I try to do with this. And you know, you study, this is your profession. For me, it was, I had some hunches, but I hadn't ever really studied it until I immersed myself in it for a couple, 3 years and was shocked. I said to somebody earlier today, I feel like I sort of red pilled myself, you know, in waking me up. Not I didn't go from, you know, right winger to left winger, but I moved. I became appalled at what had happened in plain sight during the 1970s and 80s and 90s.
Yeah. So before we go any further, let's just tell people the thesis or the basic argument of the book.
It's a story. It's a complicated story, but also a simple one. The simple version of the story is that the incredible increase in inequality, in economic insecurity, in the rich getting richer in America and nobody else, in the power of big business getting greater, both economically and politically, than it has been in many lifetimes. All of that thing that happened over the last 40 years didn't just happen. Other countries have had modest increases in inequality as well, and there are global changes, obviously, in technology and global trade and so forth. But the United States is exceptional. There is American exceptionalism, and I try to do a sort of forensic look. I hope it's not a postmortem, but a forensic look at how that happened and who did it, and all the ways in terms of the changing, the paradigm shift of how people were thinking, the rules, the regulation, the norms, the institutions that were built, all the ways in which this set of changes happened between 1971, let's say, and the end of the century.
So I want to sort of combine two questions here. Who did do it? Who, you call it evil geniuses? Who are the evil geniuses? Name us names. And then the related question, related to me anyway, you said a few minutes ago that when you immerse yourself in this, you were shocked. I'd be very curious to know what precisely shocked you.
Yeah. Well, I didn't start out with the title. I sometimes start out books with titles, and this time I didn't. I got to figure this out for myself and then try to explain it to people. So I didn't know that it was going to have these kind of evil geniuses, these recurring characters. So one of them certainly is Milton Friedman, who became well known, went from sort of the fringe, well known among economists as a fringe character in the 60s, to this nationally known figure. And that happened in the 60s and then the 70s. He was one of them. He really, he popularized and normalized and mainstreamed this idea that all that matters are profits, that selfishness is fine, dare I say, greed is good. All those things, this economic libertarianism, which had been truly a set of fringe ideas subscribed to by fringe people, until he, thanks in large measure to the New York Times Magazine in 1970, where he published over many pages this thing called the Friedman Doctrine, sort of made that an acceptable and respectable way to think about fairness, equality, economic justice, the rest, and began, he had been militantly against the New Deal since the New Deal occurred, and this was the beginning of the rollback. So he was one. Justice Lewis Powell played, oddly, a role, the Supreme Court justice, who was not a particularly well-known or consequential Supreme Court justice, but he did write this memo back in 1971 that laid out the plan that makes it look more, as I say in the book, it's like if you saw the Powell memo, this 40-page memo he wrote in 1971 and circulated to CEOs and became sort of the gospel among the economic right, you'd think in a work of fiction, this is ridiculous. This is too on the nose. This is crazy. But there it was. He was one. Charles Koch, even more than his late brother, was definitely an evil genius, remains obviously an evil genius in control, in wielding all of the power that he does between creating think tanks and his own universities and influencing other universities and creating these organizations like Freedom Works and that are into retail politics and protests. And he's definitely one of the evil geniuses and was on this case in the early 70s. Robert Bartley, who was a editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, crucially in the 1970s, and became the forum for this militant economic right. Irving Kristol, the former socialist turned original neoconservative, father of Bill Kristol, of course, was one of them. Alan Greenspan, a Milton Friedmanite, Ayn Rand pal, chairman of the Federal Reserve for 20 years, roughly. I could include any number of Wall Street people. I would, in this list of a dozen, I'll include Henry Kravis, who employed me effectively when I was your boss, when I employed you at New York Magazine, but not for that, although there's a there's a kind of anti-sentimental attachment to him for that purpose, but because he was right there in the 70s and 80s creating this new form of private equity, leverage buyout takeovers, which isn't all that went rotten with Wall Street, but was a big part of what went rotten with Wall Street. Rush Limbaugh, of course, has to be there, as does the other great media figure of his day and still, Rupert Murdoch. Another one, and finally, to make it a dozen, even Grover Norquist, who started Americans for Tax Reform 33 years ago, and just, it's a great example. Of course, he invented this thing that all Republicans have to sign if they're going to be in Congress or run for president, which is to say, I will never raise taxes. And the degree to which they, at that time in the 80s, were making no taxes, anti-taxes, and this insane phobia fetish of the central one, really, of the Republican Party, he operationalized that with his pledge, and by creating this institution that had no mission creep. It was just, this is what we're doing. This is the part of the class war I'm in charge of, me, General Norquist, and kept at it. So he's one of them. Those are my dozen.
Yeah, that's a good list. And in essence, since he inaugurated that pledge, with a couple of minor asterisk-ish exceptions, no Republican in Congress has voted for a tax increase since 1990.
Right. Well, and thank goodness he Ronald Reagan got through under the wire, raising taxes before anybody had to sign the pledge.
Yeah. Okay. So what really shocked you?
Oh, I mean, the Powell memo is shocking, as are these other memos. Again, here they are. It was secret for a year, the Powell memo. Then it was leaked, and the Kochs and their ilk were passing it around like, oh, here's what we got to do. We got to start these think tanks, take over the media, change the public conversation, start lobbying in a different way on behalf of our version of capitalism, on and on. So that that shocked me. A similar memo, or a different kind of memo, Powell in his memo in 71 had also said, and by the way, the judiciary is a ripe area to do this work. Well, at the end of the 70s, one of the other rich right-wing billionaires, Richard Mellon Scaife, commissions this memo, this longer memo that, again, step by step, plans how to take over the law, how to change the understanding of the law in favor of big business and the right. And by among other things, creating what was created a year later, the Federalist Society, which, of course, as we all know, has had this extraordinary success and had it rather quickly. I mean, certainly in the generation, had an astounding effect that has changed the law more than any. Somebody said, some famous law school professor said, it had more effect on the law than anything since the founding of Harvard Law School in 1814 or whatever it was. Right. So that astounded me. I mean, I would say of course, the degree to which it was, again, I am not predisposed to believe in conspiracy theories. Much of Fantasyland was spent debunking and bemoaning Americans' sort of increasing addiction to preposterous and untrue conspiracy theories. So I guess I was surprised in general, the degree to which, you don't have to call it a conspiracy, but it was a strategic long war that's still going on to take basically this New Deal consensus that had lasted for 40 plus years and change it. So that amazed me. Individually, I came across things that just amazed me. This meeting of a bunch of the less famous but still hugely influential legal scholars in this world at the University of Chicago. One of them, the former federal judge Richard Posner, and this meeting of theirs in 1997, sort of a generation into their full post-Reagan success. And they were, it again, like a scene in a movie where they're practically rubbing their hands and cackling at how successful they've been. And yet it isn't a secret document. It was published in the University of Chicago Law Review. Right. So again, the movie-like scenes and brazenness throughout that were barely hidden. But then as you know, I recurringly talk about in this book, was kind of, somewhat oblivious to or complacent about, or like, hey, I don't have a Rust Belt job. My job isn't being automated. I'm okay. Yeah. So I think, like a lot of people who were doing okay in the professional class, until the turn of the century, roughly, I was oblivious. So in retrospect, that shocks me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk about that period in the 90s and the Clinton presidency. And of course, he'll be speaking this week, which I was mildly surprised to see, actually. Of course, he's a former president, but times have changed. His stock has dropped a good bit in various ways, especially among younger people. What's your assessment of the Clinton presidency in economic terms in retrospect? Do you think he bought too much into what they call the neoliberal, which is the Friedmanian? It's called, in the economic sense, it's called neoliberal.
Yes. Yeah, I try to get away with explaining as quickly as I can the various ways in which neoliberal has been used, is used, whatever. But was Clinton too much of essentially a centrist rightist in the pocket of the economic right? Well, yes, but I would say that it began well before Bill Clinton became president. That what were New Democrats, many of whom, like Gary Hart, I was excited about myself in the 80s, in the 70s, or certainly in the 80s. But New Democrats were essentially a kind of Democrat who said, we believe in the free market. And in fact, social problems should be solved by the free market. And so there was really a generation of that movement in the Democratic Party before Bill Clinton was ever elected president, before he helped found the Democratic Leadership Council to propagate that, to turn the Democratic Party into that. So yeah, I think it is. I do think Democrats and liberals were played effectively. In retrospect, it's clear perhaps that it was at the time by these guys, by the economic right, by the new principles that FDR and the New Deal is all obsolete, and it's all about the market, and marketplace values are everything. And yes, and Bill Clinton. We can talk about for all of the good things that the Clinton administration did, and it did, sure. And luckily he was blessed with a prosperous decade in which to be president. Yeah. But certainly I would say in terms of in his second term, the continuing deregulation of Wall Street that he and his team presided over, that's a point where he deserves a lot of blame. Of course, in his reform of what was then called aid to families with dependent children, welfare, basically. Not that was the worst thing in the world, even the worst thing that he did, but it was emblematic of this change, this paradigm shift, where he went on NBC television and said, this guy, Charles Murray, he's got a point. But those weren't his words, and it's a bad impersonation, but that he had bought into the right's idea about social democracy, about social welfare. And you know, there's, as I try to be fair in the book about how that happened and what the 90s were like. And oh my God, they'd gotten, you know, Democrats had gotten beaten 3 times in a row and blah, blah, blah. But I do think he and the Clinton administration, you know, were kind of in a cowering posture in terms of economics for a long time. And I think the Clinton administration and through the Obama administration, for that matter, their take on economics, I think it's pretty clear, looked to a lot of white working class voters say, like, wait, how are they really that different than the Republicans on you know, supporting unions, on all these things that really affect me in my pocketbook? You know, I used to hate when people said, oh, there's no difference between the Democrats and Republicans, because of course there always has been on certainly on issues like abortion and cultural issues. But on economics, there came to be relatively little difference. And the Democratic Party on economics, it seems to me, became kind of, when no more Republicans were liberal Republicans, they became the liberal Republicans, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting. In a few chapters, you address not politics or economics per se, but sort of like the broader culture and the ways in which the culture changed in the 80s and 90s. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I another hobby horse of mine had been for a long time, had been how our plunge culturally into nostalgia that happened right after the late 60s in across the board in culture and pop culture and high culture. And writing this book and looking at this history of the 70s and 80s, I saw how specifically, how brilliantly the right, the Reaganites, had used that new nostalgia that wasn't it nice before the 60s thing, to sell Reaganism. You know, I say in the book, you know, they were selling Americans on the idea of going to Bedford Falls in It's a Wonderful Life, but they ended up living in Pottersville. So that nostalgia thing was a brilliant means by which the political and economic right used imagery and good old days America to convince a lot of people that, yeah, we don't like government, we don't need government, as a basic idea. Then it turned into, in my telling of the story, this weirder thing after the 80s of a kind of cultural stasis, not just nostalgia, which continued and everything was a reboot and a remake and a recycling in culture. But this stasis where very little changed in terms of the way music sounded or things looked or the way cars looked, the way buildings looked, all of it. And again, I don't say, I'm not enough of a conspiracy theorist to say, and they did that, they caused that, not at all. However, that the way that happened and the fact that that's true has been true for the last 25 or more years has reinforced, I think, the sense among so many people that, you know, change just doesn't happen anymore. Yes, there's computers and apps and all that, but like otherwise, change, cultural change, political change, economic change, it's just always been this way and it always will be this way. And so it had the effect of, has the effect of reinforcing people's sense that big change just doesn't happen, is impossible. And certainly for younger people who have only lived in this economy, this political economy that the evil geniuses have made what it is, have also almost only lived at a time when the more disruptive radical cultural changes, whether they're superficial or profound, and would happen every decade during the, you know, certainly through the 50s, 60s, 70s, just don't happen anymore. So I think it's you know, it sort of has become all of a piece. Anyway, that's the sort of subsidiary argument of evil geniuses.
Right. I want to ask you a question that I spend a fair amount of time thinking about. So before this age of neoliberal or supply side economic dominance. We had the age of Keynes from the 30s to the 70s. Then things happened, the horrible inflation and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system that opened the door for Milton Friedman and his people to say, there's a better way than Keynes.
Yeah.
And they charged through that door. So that was 40 years of Keynesianism. Now we've had 45 years of Friedmanism, including the worst economic catastrophe since the 1930s and a current economic catastrophe that happened because of something that befell us, but that I would argue the economic priorities we're living to rendered us ill-equipped, particularly ill-equipped to handle. I'm sure you'd agree.
I do agree.
So like, how long can they hold on? How long can this paradigm dominate?
Well, that is the $64 trillion question. I had an inkling back in 2008 that was going to be the reset moment. And like people would see that this, but it wasn't, obviously. And things went back to usual, despite Dodd-Frank and all the rest very quickly. It depends. On the one hand, you think like, and I am a kind of a sucker for cycle theories of history. Well, yep, 45 years of Keynesianism, 45 years of this, time to change again. One of the problems here is, of course, one part of the evil genius shift of the last 40 years has been the rise of a politically powerful plutocracy, the corruption of electoral democracy by these rich guys to an extent that has not existed for at least a century in this country.
United and so on.
Right. So that makes it harder for the pendulum to shift. Certainly. And what I worry about, among the things I worry about, are that the kind of simple-minded adherence to simple-minded Milton Friedmanism, basically turning selfishness and greed into this righteous mission, or just simple selfishness and greed, they're not going to let go soon enough unless we get a Franklin Roosevelt or a Teddy Roosevelt to convince them, dudes, the only way this free market system of ours is going to sustain itself and survive without you being put up against the wall eventually is for some progressive, fairly radical at this point reform. Of course, it's radical only because of this shift. If we'd just gone along as we had gone on in 1976 had turned to 2020, we'd be fine. But at this point, it needs a kind of radical shift. But I worry that we will get to this point of where the oligarchs become like Latin American oligarchs and just won't give up, and that we get into some horrible spasm of violent conflict. Because I really do, history does not repeat, but it rhymes, and I think we are rhyming with many eras, including the 30s now, and we got out of that stronger than ever, right? We'll see if we can do it again.
It's 6:30. I'm going to ask 2 or 3 more questions, then we'll turn it over to folks. So I want to take a second to remind people here, just drag your cursor across the bottom of your black Zoom box there, and click on the Q&A icon and submit a question, and I'll be reading them when I finish asking questions. I also want to remind people, click on chat, buy the book. Click on chat and buy the book. Do it right now. Okay, Kurt, it's Democratic Convention week. You have your closing section in the book talks about some things that you think need to be done, by Democrats and by we, the people. So just give people, size up, I guess just how you think, is Joe Biden putting forward a program, to your mind, that shows that he understands all the stuff that you've written about here?
I don't know about well, you should read the book, of course. I think we'll do him good. I think the outcome of the Biden-Sanders summit
Yeah.
gives me some hope that, everybody seemed to come away from that happy, that there is some understanding in Joe Biden's circle, that the Democratic Party is on economics to the left of where he has been, and that's a place that it's going to be. And so I'm hopeful, because Joe Biden, of course, is the ultimate politician, Democratic politician. I mean, I think he has real instincts about, the working man and all those things that will serve him well in going in the right directions economically. But I also think he understands, despite his arguments about Bernie, we can't afford Medicare for all and all those things. I think I am hopeful that he and his administration, God willing, can be pushed in some ways that they need to be pushed. We'll see who he makes Treasury Secretary and head of OMB and all those things. Those will be important and telling appointments if he is elected president. So I'm hopeful. My candidate was Elizabeth Warren. I will see what he does in terms of appointing her. But again, individuals don't matter. They don't matter as much as the general idea that this system, indeed, as much as you may find people say it's a rigged system or drain the swamp, whether Trump or Bernie Sanders, both of whom, of course, campaigned on that, basically the same rhetoric in 2016. It's true. It is a rigged system, and the swamp does need to be drained. And I hope that a Biden administration can see its way clear to doing some of the things that are necessary to de-rig it.
Can you rattle off a few things that you'd like to see the administration do in first?
Well, I mean, as President Obama himself has said about Obamacare and ACA, that was just a first step, and now we need to get a good public option on our way to true universal health care. Mm-hmm. They need to do that in an important way, or try to do that, and if God willing, they get the Senate and keep the House. I think, trade is a whole different set of questions since Donald Trump, that's the one place where he is, in fact, governing to the left of the evil geniuses and the economic right that run his party. Childcare obviously is a thing. I just hope all of the social policy, economic policy, Green New Deal-ish things are taken seriously in one way or another. What his big thing should be, what his, as the ACA was to Obama in 2009, 2010 should be to the Biden administration, I don't know. I mean, of course, he just as Barack Obama had the Wall Street meltdown and financial crash and burgeoning recession to deal with in 2009, so will the Biden administration, if there is one, have to deal with this pandemic and its economic consequences. So there's that. But I really just, I think more, yes, it's about the soul of America. And yes, it's about saving our democracy. And it's about all those things, those highfalutin things. And those really are the stakes in this election. Yeah. But I hope, and I think it suits him, despite his, Delawarean being too cozy with credit card companies and so on history, I think it does actually suit Joe Biden to try to be some version of the beginnings of the FDR of the 20s, as FDR was in the 30s. Yeah.
My last question is about Donald Trump. We haven't talked about him. You mentioned him, but we haven't really talked about him. To what extent do you think his scary, his authoritarian efforts play into what you've written about in this book? Is there a relationship there?
That's a good question. And I actually don't think so. I actually think that if the evil geniuses, if Mitch McConnell and Rupert Murdoch and the living evil geniuses had their meeting, they would say, no, that's wrong. Let's not do that. It was working pretty well before we had this little Mussolini despot going too far on ending the rule of law and breaking all the norms toward autocracy. So I don't think so. I could be argued out of that, but I don't think so. I think it's, to me, the autocratic instincts of Donald Trump are one more unfortunate, necessary evil in the minds of these capitalist CEO libertarians that they have to deal with, in order to get their $2 trillion tax cuts and in order to get their deregulatory blitzkrieg. It's part of Trumpism, and he'll go away and we'll get a good normal Republican again. That's what they're thinking, of course.
Right.
And so, I didn't write a book about autocracy, and somebody may have a good argument that they're connected. I don't see it yet, but
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Interesting. Okay, let's start with Karen, who asks, it seems to me that one of the key deconstructions of what you call the evil geniuses and that the Democrats acquiesced in is the attack on unions. Do you talk about that in your book?
I do indeed talk at great length about unions, and my own membership in unions and indifference to unions, and how out of the late 60s and early 70s and the counterculture and the anti-war movement helped break up essentially American liberals from American unions and the trade union movement. Absolutely. And you asked earlier, Michael, what shocked me? The crushing of unions in the 1980s. Going back and looking at that history shocked me. I remembered the air traffic controllers strike, and I remembered the Reagan crushing of that strike, boom, like that, in a night, in a day, in a week. But I wasn't aware at the time enough, certainly, of how that began this full scale squashing of the union movement, and the norms, not just the laws, but the norms that had existed about unions and strikes and strikers for since the New Deal. So yes, I talk a lot about unions, and it was crucial and it was key, and I in my talking about how we went back in time so many ways, to the time of the robber barons, to the time of inequality of the 20s and so forth. We've also gone back in terms of the relative powerlessness and the small size of union membership in America to where we were back in 1908, right? So they really it has been this weird going back in time thing that these evil geniuses have pulled off.
Yeah. Biden does incidentally talk a lot about unions, more than Obama did, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I was alluding to, that. And I think that's true, that his cultural experience in a union world in Pennsylvania and Delaware and a working class union world will be helpful in sort of setting the table for his administration.
Let's hear from Irene. Card-carrying millennial here, wasn't it a major success of the evil geniuses to tie their economic plutocratic ideas into the moral majority organizing around sexual morality, so that they made social democracy welfarism as immoral as they thought abortion is?
Yes, I mean, that was part of it. I mean, of course, then you get into the racist part of it, because of course, welfare and social welfare was identified by the Republicans, by the right, from the 60s on, with white racial resentment and racism. So yes, all of these various Faustian bargains that that the economic right made in order to win elections, racist, bigoted, homophobic, take your pick, were what they did, by any means necessary. But they kept their eye on their prize, and these other things were just the dirty business of creating a coalition that could serve their elite, serve the top, not just 1%, let's say 20% economically of Americans, but you need, of course, 50% of the voters to be with you. So how do you do that? You get them on your side by these other means, and by having Democrats and liberals who aren't so different than you on economics. So when the choice comes, like, do I want to vote for the guy who hates professors and people on television as much as I do? Yeah, I do, because otherwise they're not so different than the guy he's running against. You know.
Okay. Here's a fun question from Thomas. Oh, it just bounced off my screen. Hold on. There it is. Rupert Murdoch is a chameleon who backed Tony Blair against John Major. That's true. He did. Major, of course, was the Tory. If Murdoch perceives Trump to be a loser, would he back Joe Biden for pragmatic reasons?
That's a great question, because, of course, the New York Post, for instance, did not endorse Donald Trump in the general election in 2016. It did in the primary in New York, weirdly, but on the general election. So no, that's a great question. And how if you decide this guy is not good for whatever, my wealth, free market, whatever would make Rupert Murdoch decide that, nah, we got to get rid of this guy, is interesting, because how does he do that in the particular vessel of Fox News? Be really tough with your primetime lineup to sort of make that shift in the next 69 days or whatever it is.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about Fox. I mean, just,
I love them. I love everything about them, Michael. I don't know what you're talking about. No, it has been, I think it's hard to overstate the power of Fox News in achieving in hurting this country and achieving the goals of these evil geniuses. Unfortunately, achieving them along with changing minds along the ways that the right has had to do it to achieve political power, which is to say the racism, and all of the rest. No, Fox News, it amazes me. It has always amazed me, and it's incredibly. I don't know what more to say, except it's I mean, Roger Ailes, obviously, he's dead, so he's not on my evil geniuses dozen that I gave you, but he's one of them. It is. I think a lot about what Fox News, what Rupert Murdoch or another buyer. People talk about Mike Bloomberg should buy Fox News. And what do you do with it? Could it be changed into a respectable right operation? I mean, could you just take away the primetime guys and woman, and replace them with other people who weren't so bad in all the ways those people are bad, nativist, racist, and so forth? And what would happen to that audience? I mean, would some fraction of them go to OAN, but you'd still be Fox News? I don't know. But as a speculative operation, I often think about how that could be done and if it could be done.
Yeah, it's interesting. Okay, here's someone identifying him or herself as CB. Do you include Gingrich as a foot soldier of the evil geniuses? He's a pretty pivotal figure in this time period.
He is. I mention him. I don't go into length about him because he is. He's in the book, and his I go at greater length about Grover Norquist, who was a buddy. They mutual admiration and assistance society in the 90s. He was important, but he also, why he's not, because he's not so much all about economics. He's about Newt Gingrich, and he's about the confrontationalism that overtook the right and the Republican Party in the 90s. So I don't spend a lot of time on him, but I'm happy to. I definitely would include him among them. Although Was he? So, I mean, I feel as though he was emblematic of a moment and of a contingent and a cohort on the right, more than, an evil genius. But we could disagree.
Yeah. Oh, here's a hard question. I don't know how I would answer this, from Rich. Who do you see as today's John Maynard Keynes?
Jeez, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I'll have to think about that. I mean, it's not. I mean, I think of Piketty, if that's how we pronounce his name. Is that how we pronounce his name?
Yeah, well, I
Or
mean, if you want to
Piketty.
be
I
Piketty,
mean,
if you want to
I mean, he, I guess, is the Milton Friedman, perhaps, of
Yeah.
of the left. Who is Keynes? That's a good question. Since essentially all of mainstream economics are Keynes collectively, is that
Yeah.
effect? It's hard to pick out the person, but yeah, you economists out there could tell me who it is.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, Piketty would be, I mean, just in terms of his prominence and the way
Yeah.
he shifted the debate within economics.
I mean, in his, I mean, again, Keynes wasn't that much of a lefty at his time, but
Right.
along with Piketty and Stiglitz and Paul Krugman, who we forget is a legit economist, even though he's
Right.
an ink-stained wretch as well.
Yeah.
Those guys are in terms of public perception of economics and public understanding of economics, are those guys. I don't think, I mean, in terms of people of theoretical importance of inventing macroeconomics, for God's sake, like
Yeah.
Keynes did, I don't know who that is.
Yeah. How much did you look into and get into the study of current trends in the economics profession? Because I'm working on a book that will go into that a little bit, and it's been interesting the way the profession's been roiled since the Great Recession.
Yeah, I read Benjamin Applebaum's
Yes.
very good book about that. Very interesting book about that. And so I looked into it, but it is beyond what I define my bailiwick and evil geniuses to be.
Yeah, but it's I mean, as you know, as I'm sure a lot of people watching us know, that most of them missed the Great Recession, and there's been a lot of questioning about why that happened.
Yeah.
And,
Speaking of economics, it was interesting to go back. Of course, like so many things in this book, I knew the one-line thing. I knew the introductory paragraph, Wikipedia introductory paragraph version of these things. Like Arthur Laffer, as an economist, the fact that he was no Keynes, he was no Friedman, he was just a hustler who happened to be at the right place at the right time, and had the benefit of knowing these guys at the Wall Street Journal who invented supply side economics as a term for what he was pitching. But he was pitched by Jude Wanniski at the Wall Street Journal, in Irving Kristol's journal at the time, as a Copernican revolutionary of changing economics, because as you're suggesting, just as economists didn't really get the 2008 crash, economists, they were Wanniski and Laffer and et al. Were saying back in the 70s, classical economists is over. They don't understand inflation. They can't beat inflation. So it's an interesting thing, and so that's again, it gets back to the question of, is there between the left, the Pikettys and of the world, and what's his name at Berkeley, his partner,
Zayas.
yes, is between them and the conventional wisdom of the right? Is there a kind of paradigm shifting, important set of moderate, centrist, whatever? I don't know to the answer to that. Doesn't seem like it.
There are things in formation, and this is actually the topic of my new book, which will be out late next year.
Excellent.
If with any luck.
Good.
So maybe I'll provide some answers.
Geez, now I'm even scared that I let you read this, Michael, because you really know this thing where I'm just an amateur.
Actually, I learned quite a lot from this book. Don't worry about it. It's true. Now, here's a question that, speaking of areas of expertise, is kind of beyond mine. I don't even quite understand it, but let's try it. From anonymous attendee. I did a brief stint as a Wall Street law associate to pay off my loans. And I thought for sure that the big investment banks were doomed, that their fundamental biggest skill was being able to sell stocks and bonds so that they could provide a backstop to guarantee that an offering of either would be entirely sold. And then I thought that the internet would kill that as a skill that had any value. I thought that all basic stock offerings and most simple bond tranches would be sold by reverse Dutch auction on the internet. Obviously, I don't make my living as a prognosticator. What got in the way of that happening?
That's a great question, and certainly above my pay grade to answer. But I will say that the longest chapter in Evil Geniuses, because I think it requires a lot of careful unpacking in its enormity, is what happened on Wall Street. Is what does financialization of the economy really mean? How did that happen? And I think, but to the basic point, I think the anonymous attendee is saying, wait, in this disintermediation thing of the internet, how did these ultimate mediators, middlemen, like get bigger than ever and make more money than ever? How did that happen? Well, I try to trace exactly how that happened, and it's a stunning fact that in this age of disruption, that the one or most important effectively undisrupted industry is finance. So I think he gets, even though I don't know what double Dutch auctions are exactly, but he does get to an extraordinary point that what was happening on Wall Street in terms of its power, in terms of the manifold ways it started exercising power, its recklessness, all the rest that started happening in the 70s and continued in the 80s and 90s, just ahead, of course, of the internet revolution. So I guess from what I do know, one could argue, I guess, that it was able to get too big to be disintermediated in effect. I mean, that they changed the game enough where Wall Street and banking was no longer just these boring guys who sat at the side and, made stock offerings and raised capital for companies, to the controllers of the system. And so, again, the simplest answer would be they became so key and so central to the financial system and the financialized economy that they were able to survive and to proliferate and to pay themselves still more. And again, that's another thing that I was reminded of it, and I included in the book, that so many different studies have shown over the last X decades that managed portfolios, that picking stocks really doesn't work. That basically buying index funds or comparable versions of stock buying does as well or better than the highly paid stock person at mutual funds or your individual or even hedge funds or whatever. So again, that's a weird blue smoke and mirrors intermediation that has not been disintermediated by the kind of information freedom and overload that the internet has provided.
Yeah. Okay, here's an easier, more straightforward question, but a good one, an interesting one nevertheless, from Howard. Are Mnuchin et al. Cunning and skillful enough to perpetuate the evil geniuses regime?
Great question. They are. Cunning. I don't think Steve Mnuchin is particularly. I mean, he's cunning enough to have gotten where he is and be rich and all the rest. I think it is a measure of their success in creating the regime and sets of institutions that they have created, that even Donald Trump and Stephen Mnuchin haven't fucked it up too badly yet. For them, as far as they're concerned, right? We got our $2.4 trillion tax cut. We're getting our deregulation. So now, whether either of them or Trumpism, that is now Republicanism, has the ability or the shrewdness or the canniness or the whatever to continue this regime is an open question, because I do think, I encourage everybody to go back and look at the 2-minute final ad of the Donald Trump campaign in 2016, with images of Wall Street and bankers as the central demons of the story. And of course, that was not the way he has governed, is it?
Right.
So I think but in his way, in their way, they were brilliant enough to understand this is a real thing. People think the system is rigged, and if we can make Hillary Clinton look like the avatar of that Wall Street system, then we'll beat her. Well, it worked. So it becomes trickier in this new Republican totally Trumpified Republican Party for them to it's a more difficult needle to thread to have all this. Yes, and it wasn't a Tea Party, right? As well, from Tea Partyism through Trump. Like, wait a minute, you're telling me the banks are bad and Wall Street is corrupt and what? So it becomes, for even a shrewd version of Steve Mnuchin, hard to keep that complicated charade going.
So let's try to, it's 6:57, and let's try to send people off on a somewhat optimistic note.
Okay.
Yeah. Maybe it will be optimistic, maybe it won't be, but how optimistic are you? How do you feel about the election? What do you worry about? What are you confident about? And if in what you and I, and probably most of the 164 people watching us would consider the best case scenario of the Democrats capturing the Senate, as well as Biden winning, and the Democrats then therefore having an opportunity really to do stuff. How much do you think they can change this reality that you're describing?
No, that is the question. Like I don't know anything more than anybody else knows, and my hunches are worth subway fare beyond that. But obviously it looks more than likely that Joe Biden will be elected president, and the Senate will go Democratic. I think it looks more likely than not that will happen. If those two things happen, and obviously if they keep the House as well, then there is a big opportunity. There's a really big opportunity. These guys, the right will still be being geniusy and evil to try to keep anything from happening. And you look back in 2009, 2010, how the Kochs and their cohort, the things they said and the work they did to prevent Obamacare, this Heritage Foundation private-based universal care system, from being enacted, they're not going to go down like, oh, we lost. We don't. So it'll be tough, but I actually, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful. I think the center of gravity ideologically on economics for the Democratic Party has gotten to a pretty good place. I do. And we'll see. I mean, I mean, talk to me on November 4th. I may be more literally, of course, more hopeless than I've ever been in my entire life about the future of America, and be willing to agree with everybody that the American experiment's over if it goes the wrong way. But if it doesn't, if it goes the right way, which it might, I think there's a big chance for change. I mean, these people aren't stupid, and as I said before, we'll see where he goes, where a hypothetical President Biden goes in terms of choosing his economic team. And but on the other hand, even Larry Summers, even the famous neoliberal Clintonian Obamaite Larry Summers, has moved left. So on economics. So I will be so gleeful when and if Donald Trump and the Republicans are out of Washington power, that I probably will be, many of us, I think, will be too overjoyed, and then we'll have to get down to business and say, okay, where can we go? What can we do? What should be the big thing to put this stake in the ground to say we are done with 45 years of
Yeah.
Milton Friedmanism.
Well, I'll be doing all I can to help bring that day along.
There you go, sir. Work of the angels.
Yeah, the book is Evil Geniuses. Someone said it's engaging and enraging, enthralling and appalling. It's all of those things.
You said that, Michael.
I did. And, but really, it's terrific. And please buy it. And thanks to Politics and Prose. Thanks to everyone who participated and spent the hour with us. And Kurt, most of all, thank you.
Oh, thank you, man. It was great. I really enjoyed it.
A lot of fun. So I guess that's it. We say good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.